And pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Item 2, apologies. We do have 2 council members on apologies this evening. Councillor Ros Harley, and I'm just checking whether Councillor Jimmy Murphy is an apology or has an approved leave of absence. If you could just bear with me for a moment. So yes, Councillor Murphy is on an approved leave of absence. So we'll go straight to public question time. Welcome members of the public gallery to this evening's meeting. Nice to see you again. We don't have any set order. We just would ask that when you do come forward, you just state your name, the suburb that you live in and the item that you're speaking to. Go ahead, Damien. Quiet night. Okay, so we'll go to declarations of interest. I'll now hand over to the CEO.
Thank you, Mayor Cole. I've received a declaration from yourself, Mayor Cole, in relation to item 5.5, a declaration affecting impartiality. One of the submitters is a friend through, I'm reading, through our children formerly being in the same playgroup. The second declarations from Councillor Loden in relation to item 5.5 on impartiality. The extent of the interest is that Councillor Loden knows one of the people located within the consultation area through his son's school. Another declaration of impartiality from Councillor Loden in relation to items 5.6 and 5.7. The extent of the interest being that Councillor Loden has a personal association with one of the affected residents through his involvement in the fathering project. And the last declaration is from myself in relation to confidential item 11.1 relating to the CEO's annual performance review. Thank you.
Thank you very much, CEO. We will now deal with the items before us. So what I'll do is I'll go to the items that have been raised by members of the public gallery this evening so that they may not wish to stay and listen to us ask questions on other items. But you're very welcome, but we will go to those items first. So the first item raised this evening was item 5.6, number 48, Agena Street, Mount Hawthorn, proposed single house. Questions on this item, please. Councillor Loden.
Thank you, Mayor. Just the question from the floor around the garage width and why that's not included within the refusal as well. If you would provide just a response to that query.
Through the Chair, there's a section in the officer's report, page 179, that details the garage and its assessment against the R-Code's requirements as well as the Beaufort policy. It indicates that the garage does comply strictly with the R-Code and the Beaufort policy requirements. Aside from that, it does go on in this officer's recommendation and the report itself to detail how it is considered to be compatible with the streetscape, in particular reference to clause 67. So on balance, the streetscape needs to be considered in its entirety. It's I'd caution against assessment against just one aspect of the built form, but the garage appearance together with the openness in the front setback area, additional canopy cover, deep soil as well, together with the built form outcome in its entirety, on balance, administration's of the view that it does satisfy clause 67, particularly its compatibility with the setting.
Councillor Loden, any further questions? Councillors? On this matter, Manager, we did discuss during the week that the grounds for refusal that's recommended by administration is on the boundary wall for this particular development. That's the only grounds. And we did talk about the fact that when it was deemed a group dwelling, that there was a condition in place to require that the boundary walls be built simultaneously. Just wanted to ask the question, would there be any way that a legal deed or a legal arrangement could be put in place against 2 separate lots to require 2 separate, potentially separate landowners? I think at this stage I'm not quite sure. Could there be any legal arrangement to require that 2 different lots have a boundary wall constructed simultaneously?
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, we did have that conversation, and since then, administration is still considering any potential options around that, not only in terms of the condition, but any legal mechanism to ensure that outcome is achieved and to ensure that it is enforceable. You're right in that ultimately there's two separate lots now, two separate land holdings, and potentially one could be on-sold. So really the question around what is the ability to enforce that a new potential landowner is required to develop and undertake a particular planning approval. They could choose for that to lapse, and in that scenario you could potentially have a two-storey boundary wall. That's the reality based on no condition being imposed. So we are trying to better understand what that means, and in terms of being able to take enforcement on that potential new landowner would be incredibly challenging because it is not actually tied to the issue isn't really tied to that lot. It's really to ensure compliance with an adjoining property. So a lot of issues at play, but we are trying to better understand that and seeking advice at the moment. I did touch base with the applicant as well in regards to this matter, and I believe they will be providing some additional information to city staff. I'll advise you prior to the council meeting.
At this stage, that sounds like a high-risk proposition, but I guess that's unresolved until that advice comes through. Okay. And just in relation to administration's rationale for, I know that previously administration has recommended approval and council has actually put forward alternate reasons for refusal. Just in relation to the canopy coverage, is there any reason why that hasn't been included as part of the reasons for refusal? You've already outlined why, you've talked about the garage doors and you've already outlined that, but so that I understand administration's position, but on the canopy cover, could you just explain why that has not been treated as a grounds for refusal?
Through you, Madam Mayor, again, there's some commentary in the report on page 179 around the landscaping provision. So it is correct from the residents this evening that the applicant is seeking a departure to the built form policy landscaping requirements. Approximately 21% and 23% for the two properties. That doesn't mean that it necessarily needs to be refused on those grounds. There's still an opportunity to consider against the performance requirements. Ultimately, the landscaping provided is still within the front setback area, so it will achieve some softening of the development as viewed from the street. There is deep soil planting in the front setback area as well. So there will be a contribution to the canopy coverage overall, and against the performance requirements, it's administration's view that it does satisfy those, and on that basis, not a relevant reason for refusal.
And has any advice been sought on whether 30% could be achieved? I know that the species and the situation of the driveway has been looked at previously, but has that been revisited with this fresh application?
Through you, Madam Mayor, not through this fresh application. However, you may recall that a similar question was raised at the briefing session when this matter was considered in February. And we actually sought comment from our landscape architect on the city's design review panel. Their advice at the time was to pursue the landscaping plan as proposed, noting that there are some concerns around the proximity of each of those trees being, closely located to one another. But in the landscape architect's view, that would be the best option in terms of maximising canopy coverage on site, and they suggested that the applicant pursue the plans as proposed.
Councillor Gontaszewski.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to the Manager of Development and Design. Just in relation to the landscaping plan as proposed. So we've got the DRP landscape architect that has essentially stated that the placement of the trees within the rear area is potentially likely to impact on their viability. Has there been? I recall, I think from last time, that there was some concerns around the, this overplanting also contributing to a reduction in natural light and ventilation. And I think this was raised from the gallery too. Could I just get some commentary on that? And if it's in the report, could you tell me where it is? That would be great.
Through you, Madam Mayor, it's actually not in the report, that particular question. In terms of some commentary, that was identified as a reason for refusal previously. That was not administration's view. Ultimately, there is some landscaping and canopy coverage proposed to the rear of the property. That is located to the eastern side. Administration's not of the view that that would actually create extensive overshadowing or ability to access sunlight. There is some opportunity still for some solar access from that perspective, and in terms of ventilation, it isn't enclosed in that way. So those wouldn't be administration's views in terms of reasons for refusal or valid reasons for refusal.
Councillors, any further questions on 5.6? Okay, we'll move on to the next application, which is 5.7, number 48A, Agena Street, Mount Hawthorn, proposed single house. Questions in relation to this item? I'll ask a question, Manager. Now, this one has the added complexity of the overshadowing. So can you just talk us through the fact that, because I think it's the same situation, because they're now no longer group dwellings, no simultaneous construction, the risk is that one could be built and then you would have serious overshadowing of the other. So where it wasn't raised as an issue previously, it's now an issue in play because of the fact that these are two separate dwellings. I'm just looking for some confirmation if that's right, or any further information.
Yes, Madam Mayor, that is correct. Ultimately, administrations assess the proposals separately because they are two separate proposals and two separate land holdings, albeit the same landowner. This has the added complexity of potential overshadowing on the basis that it would potentially overshadow up to 60% of the adjoining property to the south, which is 48 Agena Street, so that far exceeds the requirements in the built form, the R codes, and there has been no, mitigating methods to reduce that impact on overshadowing. So on that basis, that forms part of administration's recommendation for refusal.
And just because I can't actually read my iPad at the moment, previously, when they were group dwellings, in terms of the overshadowing of 48A onto 48, was any of the overshadowing in the garden alfresco area, or was it all predominantly to the boundary wall, which has no openings?
The latter, Madam Mayor, and it didn't overshadow major openings either.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any further questions in relation to 48A Agena? Councillor Castle.
Through you, Mayor Cole, it's really a question in relation to the previous item as well, in relation to the landscaping, which I've just lost the section. In the report, it refers to the reasons that the landscaping is considered satisfactory is based on the fact that there's no vegetation right now on the block. So I guess my question is would this have been calculated differently if there was an existing property there or existing home with vegetation or trees on the block? Because it seems, well, I won't comment on that. That's just my question.
Through you, Madam Mayor, to clarify, in terms of how much landscaping is on the site at the moment, which is nil, that isn't, I'll clarify that wasn't the point to say that any landscaping is better than nothing. So that wording might just need to be clarified. It was just more a straight assessment of currently there's nil vegetation on site. However, the canopy coverage that is being proposed would contribute to the city's overall green canopy, which is one of the specific requirements under the built form policy.
Councillors, just one further question, Manager, just in relation to the use of Section 67M of the Planning and Development Regulations. We're talking about street context, and you've described how learning through SAT appeals is not to just restrict street context to one element, but I think just in relation to the point that no other dwelling on a Gina Street has more than a 50% width of a car park garage over the lot. I'm just, I think that for me that seems a valid point, but I would welcome your perspective on that.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I would agree that it is a valid point, and that's the reason why administration intentionally included it in the report, because ultimately we're going to give you a balanced report that flags all of these matters to be considered. My take on that would be there is particular garage provisions in the R codes and the built form policy. The R code provision sets out that you're trying to the intention is to set back garages. This proposal strictly complies with that because it is set back greater than a metre from the front of the building, on that basis that it achieves the intent of minimising the impact or reducing the impact of the garage as viewed from the street. That would need to be balanced in terms of the view that it does occupy 75% of the garage width. But from my perspective, I think that the proposal satisfies the intent of reducing the impact of the garage as viewed from the street by virtue of being set back that 1 metre.
Councillors, any further questions? Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you. Policy 711 that's currently got an amendment out for advertising that relates to garage width. When do we anticipate that would be coming back to council?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the advertising for the policy hasn't yet commenced. Hoping that will commence in the next couple of weeks, and depending on the nature and number of submissions, would hope that will come back to council by the end of the calendar year. Okay.
And just, I suppose, for the purpose of those people who are interested in the gallery, just generally speaking, again, depending on the complexity of what comes back from advertising, if that is then returned to council so the amendment, the intent would be for that to return to council and then be adopted. And at what point in planning terms does that policy become seriously entertained?
Through you, Mayor Cole, once council has finally adopted for the garage provisions, once council has finally adopted those policy provisions, they'll be certain and imminent, so can be implemented as local planning policy provisions. There are a couple of provisions in the policy that vary things in the R codes or Design WA that require the approval of the Commission. So the point when those ones would become certain and imminent and therefore able to be implemented would be once they have Council and Commission approval. And there is usually a time lapse between that approval being granted at the Council meeting and the policy being published in the newspaper or published in accordance with the regs. So it's just that time in between once it's been approved and is imminently about to be published that it would be able to be implemented.
Okay. And are the proposed changes in relation to garage widths and how they will be treated under the city's policy, are they things that need to be that require Commission approval because they vary the R codes?
Through you, Mayor Cole, from memory, no.
Councillors, any further questions on item 5.7? Okay, thank you. The next item raised was item 5.3, which is numbers 17 to 39 Robinson Avenue, Perth, alterations and additions to hotel. This is an amendment to an approval and an unauthorised existing development. Any questions on this item, 5.3? No questions. Thank you. We'll move on. So now we'll go back to the beginning of the agenda and move through the items sequentially, the items we haven't already asked questions on. So that takes us to item 5.1, number 161 Loftus Street, Leederville, 10 multiple dwellings, amendment to approval. Any questions? Councillor Loden?
Just a minor one, a typo is, I believe, possibly. Says the first approval was granted the 9th of September 2019. Is that supposed to be 2014?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, that's correct. It should be 2014. We can amend that before the agenda is published.
Any further questions on 5.1? Okay. 5.2, number 12, Nova Lane. Oh, you did want to ask a question on 5.1? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Mayor Cole. Through you to the Director, I just wanted to get some clarification on the process here. We've got a change in Condition 1 on the public art amount that was previously approved by Council. The development is now completed and the occupancy permit approved. So are we not? I mean, I just really want to get my head around this is a retrospective change to the DA on a development that's already completed. So just clarifying whether we're able to actually do that and examples or precedents that's been set on other similar changes in the past.
Through you, Mayor Cole. What's actually occurred is that at the time the development approval was issued and the building permit was issued, the landowner entered into or signed a declaration, a stat dec with the city stating that they would pay the public art contribution for the amount that was quoted in the condition. However, they didn't pick up that when they lodged the building permit, the cost of development had altered, and as it had in that original or in the amended application in 2016. So when it came time for the applicant to obtain the strata subdivision, the city was reconciling those conditions, noted that the amount hadn't yet been paid, and went back to the landowner, who advised that while they were still committed to paying the amount, that the cost of development had been amended, and sought the city's request to amend that. And we've looked back to the original application form for that extension of time in 2016, and that reflects the amended amount of 2.5 million, as does the building permit issued after that. So it's more an administrative error as opposed to the applicant unknowingly trying to amend it after the development's proceeded.
Thank you, Mayor. I mean, having not been part of that decision, I was just trying to clarify whether that decision not to amend that amount was an intent by Council at that time. So that's, I suppose my question is that it is an administration error, not a change on the intent of the Council's decision at that time.
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, that's correct. The paperwork would indicate that it's just an administrative error.
Okay, we'll move on to 5.2, which is number 12 Nova Lane, North Perth, single dwelling. Any questions? Councillor Gondaszewski.
Just in relation to the condition around visual privacy, I just have a question through you, Mayor, to the Manager of Development and Design, I presume, around an assessment of the impact of obscuring and permanently fixing master suite kitchen and family dining area windows. And then I guess also just in terms of the summary assessment on page 31, it doesn't specify visual privacy as requiring discretion, and I guess usually it would, and then that would be met. So could I just get some commentary on that, please?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the plans that the applicant has provided on page 46, specifically in relation to elevation 2 and 4, show those windows to the kitchen, dining and living room, I think it was, as having obscured glazing there. So in order for that, and that's been assessed as though that meets the visual privacy requirements. So to ensure that that screening is implemented in accordance with the plans, we've just provided a condition that specifies that needing to be undertaken.
Okay, I thought that was going to be the case. I couldn't quite see it on the plans. Could I get some commentary, or has any comment on any, from a design perspective and a future amenity of residents perspective, and I guess a building code compliance perspective, if windows to those rooms are permanently fixed, what does that mean in terms of that compliance? I'm just, is there an interaction?
Through you, Mayor Cole, we can seek some advice from in regards to the building requirements and provide that in the briefing notes. In terms of access to light, and I believe that there is still other. First off, access to light will still be maintained because they're just going to provide the obscure glazing and not actually affix anything onto the window in terms of a fixed screening material. There is other windows. You can't see it. There's not an internal section that's provided, but there are a few other windows internally that would still provide some light and ventilation to those areas, but we can confirm through the briefing notes.
Thank you. That would be great. And a question in relation to the proposed bin store that I note was added in this iteration of the plans. Looks like there's 2 bins in there. Has anyone spoken to the applicant about October, and FOGO and varying October next year, and whether that's feasible long term?
Through you, Mayor Cole, we can provide some advice in the briefing notes on that.
Councillors, just in relation to the boundary walls and the way that there's 2 boundary walls and the roof terrace then requires, so it's not by north, south, east, west, but elevation 4 on page 46 and elevation 2 on page 46. Was there any, noting that there weren't any objections from the neighbours, was there any concern over the sort of bulk of having the 2 boundary walls at that above height going up to the roof terrace on those 2 elevations?
Through you, Mayor Cole. So on elevation 4, there's going to be a boundary wall there that I believe has an average height of 6 metres, and then the wall steps in between, I think it's 3 metres, and then reduces as it goes up to the terrace area to a setback of 1.4 metres. So the boundary wall is only to the 2nd floor, and the administration's assessment is that section of boundary wall largely abuts the neighbour's section of boundary wall, also abuts their swimming pool, so provides some privacy there, and that their other sections of the wall provide varying materials and are broken up with those greater setbacks and that large section of obscured glazing.
And the other elevation was elevation 2, where you've got the rendered brickwork. Is that how far setback is that?
Through you, Mayor Cole. On the ground floor, it's set back approximately 1.8 metres, and then it increases for the first floor between 1 metre and 1.5 metres along the entire length of the wall. And the city is currently assessing an application on the adjoining site there that will be coming to a future council meeting that does also have boundary walls.
Okay, that sounds like it all works, and I note no overshadowing because of the orientation of the lots. Okay. Any further questions on this item? Okay. Item 5.3 we've dealt with, so we move to item 5.4, which is 377 Walcott Street, Corbinia, proposed for multiple dwellings. This is an amendment to an approval. Councillor Loden.
The report includes a condition for a 1.6 metre balustrade, and I was just wondering, will that balustrade be visible? There's some views of the property from the rear that are shown in the plans, which obviously don't have the balustrade on there, or I don't think have the balustrade on there. So I'm just wondering, will the balustrade be visible from the rear of the property?
Through you, Mayor Cole. We don't believe so. So when at the rear of the property, the roof terrace is set in, I believe it's 12 metres from the rear of the boundary, and given the height of it, it's unlikely that you'll be able to see it. And that goes the same with when on the roof terrace, with the screening there and also the location of the terrace in the centre of the roof, there would be no ability to look down into the properties beyond there.
My other question was, I noted that the submission of this application for amendment was prior to the actual approval. I don't know if that happens regularly, but the date that this application was submitted was before Council formally approved the previous version. Is that correct?
Through you, Mayor Cole. I believe the application came in on the 30th of May and it went to the 30th of April Council meeting.
Councillors, I did have a couple of questions. The terrace seems to have caused some concerns of the submitters that have responded to this re-advertised application. I was just wondering, in relation to the percentage of the roof surface area, do you know basically what percentage the roof terrace occupies of the roof surface area? I'm happy for you to take it on notice.
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, we'll provide that in the briefing notes.
And the other issue is the visual impact of the 1.6 metre screening. Can you just provide some comment on whether there'll be visual impact from the street or the neighbours from the screening around the roof terrace?
Through you, Mayor Cole. So as mentioned, the roof terrace is located within the centre of the roof, and that's the edge of the screening is 6.3 metres from the northwestern boundary, and then beyond that there's still a further 12 metres to the right of way. So given the setback and then the height, we don't believe that it would be visible from the street.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, we did have some questions from a submitter who was concerned about the ground levels being used in terms of the calculation of height, and I know that you responded in a very full way to council members via email, and we can send that response on to the submitter. But I thought for the purposes of the meeting, they may be listening on the live stream, that perhaps you could just give perhaps you don't have to go into all the detail, but perhaps you could just give a very brief overview of those issues, because I did say to the submitter that I would raise that as a question at the council briefing this evening.
Through you, Mayor Cole. So in the advice provided to council members, it was just clarified that the maximum height of the building is measured at the point immediately below that section of wall. So what we've done is taken the spot levels provided on the site feature survey, and then measured to the top height of that wall, and that's determined that the maximum building height is 10.3 metres, which is less than the 11.2 deemed to comply requirement. And we've also measured, I believe on a section of the plans what's quoted in the report is a height of 10.5 metres, and that was using the height at the natural ground level at the boundary, which is incorrect for the purposes of the definition. So the correct measurement is 10.3 metres in height, measured from the spot level immediately below the highest section.
This was just in relation to the concerns around the potential, I guess, visual privacy impacts from the roof terrace. Is there any diagrammatic way that, the sort of line of sight is determined that's not going to require the purchase of, significant amounts of software or anything? Like, I guess you've sort of advised that from your estimation, the placement of the roof terrace in essentially the centre of the roof, and then the setbacks, etc., would mean that there is no impacts to surrounding neighbours from people that may be standing on the roof terrace at the point where the screen is. I'm I'm trying to think. I'm pretty sure that I've seen some sort of diagrammatic representation of that sort of looking up or looking down. Do we have access to that, or is that something that could be provided just to, given that the concerns from submitters around the inclusion of the roof terrace, to confirm that there is or isn't going to be any impact on them from the inclusion of this design?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it's not something that the city has, but we can check tomorrow with the applicant whether or not they would be able to provide that.
Thank you. So the discussion about the visibility from the property to the northwest, or obviously from Walcott Street, it's inconceivable to me that you'd be able to see the roof terrace. That's fine. But certainly from the adjacent properties, and particularly so in response to the submissions in relation to the visual impact, the applicant's comment was about the roof terrace. Where I was, there was concern. I know. Well, we know that there have been some concerns raised, and particularly if you assume there's going to be a similar height development to the southeast or along Walcott Street, and concerns about visually. So the comment is from the applicant: the roof terrace now fits centrally and sits partly into the roof space, and the screening used is considered architecturally appealing. There's no comment. So the recommendation for approval is in accordance with the plans. Do we know what and I may have missed it, but the screening that's proposed looks to be just obscured glass. Is that the intent? Is that what we understand to be the screen wall, which will be 600 high?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, that's correct. It would be a screen wall on top of the existing wall up there. Sorry, obscure glass, yes.
Okay, and by virtue of the 1600 mil height from ground level, even though there's reduced setbacks to the side, or even though there's no, it meets the deemed to comply definitions of the R codes because of the 1600 high. Is that correct?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes. The screening, the visual privacy requirement, regardless of the setback distance, is 1600 from natural ground level.
Are you thinking, or are you still asking questions?
I nodded in acknowledgement. I should have said.
Okay.
Thank you.
You looked deep in thought.
That too.
Are there any further questions in relation to 5.4? Okay, and we'll make sure that email is sent to the submitter that had concerns about the natural ground levels and the measurements. Next item is 5.5, number 11 Buxton Street, Mount Hawthorn, proposed single house. Councillor Loden?
This design looks to be intended towards a subdivision of the lot. I'm not even sure we can consider this, but if it was subdivided with the minimum size at the rear, will the development meet the rear setback requirements?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it is capable of subdivision. That has not been applied for by the applicant. To answer that question, we need to know where that future subdivision line would be. So I'm not sure if I can answer that question.
My understanding is there would be a minimum size that it could be subdivided to, and if they sliced it to achieve that minimum size for the rear part of the block, would that be far enough away to meet those requirements? And I guess we have to consider this application, but what happens in that situation if someone theoretically built a wall right on where a future boundary was going to be and then subdivided it? Would council be able to then say, no, you can't because it doesn't meet a setback requirement?
Through you, Madam Mayor, ultimately at that subdivision stage, a condition would be imposed requiring compliance with R code requirements. So that is a check it's a condition that would need to be cleared by virtue of administration making sure that the code requirements have been met. So there is that check in there. That's not to say, however, that they need to still comply with that setback requirement. So again, I don't know where that future subdivision line lies, but ultimately there is potential for the lot to be subdivided and for the setbacks to be met.
Just a question on the street
Councillor
setback.
Gonchevsky.
Sorry.
Yeah, misfired on the button.
Just a question on the street setback. So it's proposing 5.2 to 6 metre articulated street setback, and the deemed to comply requirement is 7.3. And again, if it's here, I'm really sorry. Can we get some information on the detail as to what was used in relation to calculate the 7.3, what degree of consistency there is within street setbacks of adjacent properties and the specific measurements around the directly adjacent properties, as the applicant has used this as their justification for the street setback variation? Is that possible?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that is possible. For the adjoining lots that were used to calculate this average street setback, I'll just read them out. Would you like me to read them out? Sure. For 3 Buxton, 6.7 metres was the setback. For 5 Buxton was 9.3 metres. 7 Buxton, 8.0 metres. And 9 Buxton, 5 metres. There's only 4 properties used because that's the extent of the street block. And the average for that was 7.3 metres. I'll note that the applicant does contest the measurements used by the city. The city used its records based on previous planning approvals. And just for your information, the applicant arrived at a 6.8 metre average street setback.
And can I there is an existing crossover on the block, and it's a double crossover or a single crossover? Is there any intention to change or expand that as part of this process if approved?
Through you, Madam Mayor, there is an existing crossover. It is located in approximately the same placement as the proposed crossover. It was a single width crossover, and it is proposed to be extended to 5 metres in width as measured from the street boundary.
And just to confirm, there's no trees that are being proposed to be removed as part of that expansion, is there?
Through you, Mayor Cole, no.
Councillors, any questions? Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you. The elevations that are... where are we? No, that's okay. I'll wait till next week for that one. Thank you. Sorry, Madam Mayor, I'll wait till next week. Thanks.
Can I just ask administration, when number 9 was approved, that was seen to be, by council's perspective, after it was approved under delegated authority, a bit of a breach of the five-a-side setback provision. If that is now being used to calculate the setback, so that's obviously had some impact. Has that sort of has any of the feedback that's been provided at the forum that was held on character retention, and the fact that this section of the street has put in a character retention nomination, has that been considered in terms of the assessment of the setback issue, given that even with number 9 being at 5 metres and it then being calculated at 7.3, it's still as much as a 2 metre variation.
Through you, Mayor Cole, it absolutely does influence the average street setback. Ultimately, if we were to speculate and say that number 9 Buxton Street, the setback was greater than the 5 and was more consistent with the adjoining residents, there still would be a departure at play. So nonetheless, there is a departure being sought from the applicant. So it doesn't technically meet the city's built form policy, so we'll have to have regard for the performance requirements, and ultimately that comes down to, similar to our previous discussion around Egina Street, and how the building sits within the streetscape, having regard for not only the street setback but everything within that streetscape and what defines streetscape. And I guess a judgment needs to be called by or needs to be made by elected members in terms of whether that is or is not in keeping with the existing streetscape. Acknowledging there is a character retention area nomination that's running concurrently, we don't want to preempt that, but ultimately that judgment just needs to be made as to whether this is or is not appropriate in terms of the built form outcome.
And just in relation to the fact that the applicant does state in their paperwork that they may subdivide in the future, is council under any obligation to reduce a setback on the basis that an applicant may wish to have a future subdivision option?
Through you, Mayor Cole, you are not obliged to contemplate a reduced street setback because of a future subdivision, although that is a consideration for a landowner, as I would assume. But ultimately, we need to have regard for what's before us, and a subdivision is not before us.
Thank you. And in relation to the colours, it talks in the report about the fact that the colours are grey render, red brick and white roof, and that this reflects colour palette of the street. But condition 10 talks about the colour... Oh, sorry, I have to read condition 10. I should try to go to it. My newly downloaded, updated Docs on Tap, which is very slow. Condition 10, colours and materials schedule. Prior to commencement of development, a detailed schedule of external finishes, including materials and colour schemes and details, shall be submitted to and approved by the city. My question is, given that there's quite a bit of talk in the report about how these this colour palette reflects the sort of in keeping with the street, I'm just wondering why that wouldn't be conditioned at planning approval stage.
Through you, Madam Mayor, on the elevations, they show the intended materials and details, and in the city's or in the officer's report, there's a section on the DRP referral that ultimately secured the acceptability of the colours and materials being proposed, and we worked with the applicant as part of that process. So there's enough certainty around the intent of the colours and materials, and that condition imposed simply just requires that detail to be provided at a subsequent stage, consistent with what is contained on the development approval plans, and that will give us an opportunity to refer that to the city's DRP as required to confirm exactly those details. But adequate provision has been provided on the elevation plans that shows what's intended.
Councillor Toppelberg.
Thank you. Just to confirm, on page 138, it says the application is consistent with the objectives of the character retention policy in terms of the dwelling's built form, presentation to the street and impact of the development on the neighbouring properties. So are we to assume that the officer view on the character elements of this area means that pitch roof, regardless of the level of the pitch, but that it has pitch roof, it has eaves, and I guess the other question I have, or area of concern, which it is a question, in the commentary about the access for the street parking being off the primary street, there are examples given, well, first of all, it's where there is an existing crossover, and there are other examples given of garages and also where there are carports to the street. In that section of Buxton Street, are there any, I will ask, and you won't have the answer available now, are there any other fully enclosed double garages to the street? I can give you the answer as well, but that's all right, I'll ask it as a question. And I guess the officers are effectively saying that they support the intent, irrespective of the future intent to subdivide, that's irrelevant for this application, that I suppose the essence of the character retention, I'll get the exact words, consistent with the objectives of the character retention policy, are we to then expect that applications along or throughout the character retention area, if it is something that progresses, would expect to see double garages throughout the precinct at the street front, where the opportunity exists for them to be provided elsewhere?
Through you, Mayor Cole, there are a few questions in there. Ultimately, administration is not going to preempt what happens with the character retention area nomination. I'm not in a position to do so. But as part of our assessment, we have had regard for the character retention policy in terms of its objectives and overarching principles, and that is what the assessment has touched on. It picks up on some of those key streetscape characteristics as understood by administration around the roof form, colours, materials and building bulk and scale. So I wouldn't say, I'm not in position to preempt that double garages will form part of any future character retention policy requirement, but we have had regard for some of the characteristics found in the area, and I guess that's the intent behind that assessment. In terms of double garages that front onto Buxton Street, I will need to confirm those with you. Number 9 Buxton Street would be one of those. I'll need to check 14 Buxton Street, but I can confirm that in the briefing notes.
Councillors. Councillor Castle.
Through you, Mayor Cole. I'm sorry to jump back a bit, but a question following on from Councillor Gontaszewski's question about calculation of average setbacks. You went through the setbacks of the 3579, I believe. Can you just outline, do we only take into account the setbacks on that particular side of the road, or is there no consideration for setbacks on the even side of the road?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the deemed to comply requirement under the city's built form policy requires you to have regard for those adjoining properties on that side.
Councillors. Just to flag an amendment on the street setback, I'm not going to name a particular distance tonight, but I'd like to have a bit more of a think about that and perhaps chat with you about how that would work, given that it is a staged, staggered setback. So just to flag that. Any further questions this evening? Okay, moving on to item 5.8, food stall holder fees, minor review. This would, when we're at council next Tuesday, this will be an absolute majority decision required because it's a change to fees and charges. Any questions? Acting Director. I have a question. When I discussed this item with the Manager of Compliance and Regulatory Services, we did discuss taking this a step further and actually including talked about including event-based food stall holders, where the charge is currently $50 to $80 to attend an event. So this is separate to the food stall holder's annual permit for attending markets, which the item deals with, which is great. But this is about the other element, which is the food stall holder's event-based, where food stall holders pay $50 to $80 for a permit to attend an event, so not a regular market, not a market that's coordinated by a market provider. We did talk about waiving the fee for stall holders with fixed premises in the City of Vincent, given that they are already paying the fixed premises fee, but that hasn't made its way into the report. So before flagging an amendment, I just wanted to ask if there's any reason why administration hasn't recommended that.
Through you, Mayor Cole, in terms of the event-based initiatives that the city is looking to run in its public spaces, the fee is generally waived for those stall holders, and so we didn't feel that at this point in time it was necessary to change the fee and charge across the board without better understanding what the impact of that change would be.
Thank you for your explanation. I'm just flagging an amendment to remove the fee for food stall holders, event-based permits for food stall holders with fixed premises in the City of Vincent. Thank you. Any further questions? Okay. Next item is Infrastructure and Environment, 6.1, Minor Parking Restriction Improvements Amendments. Any questions? I have a question. Just sometimes when we do these minor amendments and we just don't consult or deal with neighbours, etc., that sometimes ends in tears. So I just wanted to ask whether there's been any liaison with the nearby residents on Shakespeare Street about the 5 metre no stopping zone, and also on Scott Street where the 2 parking bays have been removed. Has there been any consultation with the neighbouring properties?
Through you, Michael, not to my knowledge, but I'll take the question on notice and I'll make sure there's some information in the notes.
And just in relation to Grosvenor, where it's a conversion of taxi rank to taxi rank at night, loading zone during the day, has there been any consultation with the Scotsman over that?
Again, Michael, not to my knowledge, but I'll take the question on notice and double check that.
Just also, rather than just, if it hasn't been done, would it be possible for a member of staff, whether it be our place manager for Beaufort Street on the Grosvenor Road change or a member of the engineering team, I&E team, be able to actually, make it known to the neighbouring properties that this change is being considered by council? Would that be possible?
That would be possible next week, Michael.
Thank you very much. Moving on to Community and Business Services, 7.1 Investment Report as at 31st of July 2019. Any questions? Councillor Hallett.
Probably more for the briefing notes, but just wondering if we can get an update on a project that was mentioned a couple of meetings ago around reviewing fossil fuel investments. I think there was an intern or someone else that was working on it.
Yes, through Mayor Cole, I can give you an update on that. So the city did have an intern do some work and had a look at the various institutions, banks basically, that don't invest in fossil fuel companies or in fossil fuels generally. So we do have a better list now of those institutions. Now, most of those institutions sit under the A2 category, which you'll see is referred to a little bit further in that report and is based as per our policy. And there are certain percentages that the city is limited to investing in those companies. We need to do a little bit more work on the return and the security of those institutions. So the interns highlighted which institutions don't invest in fossil fuels based on what information is publicly available, because a lot of the information around those institutions isn't publicly available, so it's not certain which ones do and don't invest in fossil fuels. But we are now working to we're working with some brokers and with some various platforms that can provide us with some information around the security of those institutions for our investments, as well as the returns that we're likely to get. That will then form part of a review of the model we use, because we have a model that sits in the background that determines where our investments go, which is based on our policy as well as the return and security of each of those institutions. And we'll bring that to a workshop to discuss with Council any changes to the policy and any changes to our model. So the work has progressed, but we need to make sure that we're secure before we make any decisions around changing the investment portfolios and which institutions we're investing in.
Councillor Loden.
Just a follow-up question. To my understanding, Bank of Queensland and ME Bank are both divested, and if you add those two percentages up, that's larger than the percentage currently divested as per the report. So I just wanted to check on that.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. I'll have to take on notice whether those two institutions were included in this list. I don't think they were. There are claims that some of those institutions are non-fossil fuel, and they don't invest in any fossil fuels. But they haven't provided the evidence necessary for us to confirm that independently. So the claim alone isn't enough for it to warrant a non-fossil fuel status. From our perspective, we need to make sure that they've been independently verified rather than just self-verified. But I'll take that on notice and provide that in the briefing notes.
Councillors, any further questions on 7.1? Okay, 7.2, authorisation of expenditure for the period 1st to 31st of July 2019. Councillor Hallett.
Just in terms of one of the payments to catalyse around the FOGO Community Engagement Project, somewhat tangential, but just wondering if we could get some more detail about the different things that we're doing with Catalyse, because I noticed, because we weren't involved in some of the previous data sets that we were looking at earlier, which are the ones that we're involved with?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I think the only current engagement with Catalyse is around the FOGO market research. The presentation I circulated earlier today to council members was a generic Catalyse survey provided to all local governments, if that was the reference.
Yeah, and just that we weren't one of the participating councils, so just curious about that.
Through you, Mayor Cole, just to confirm, we previously did participate in the Community Perception Survey 3 years ago, but we haven't engaged them again at this stage.
Councillors, I have a question. One of the items is City of Vincent contribution for management of Lake Munga. I'm just wondering if that's whether we have some kind of agreement in place, if that's an annual fee, $14.6 thousand. Can I have some background on that, please?
Yes, Mayor Cole, I'll take that question on notice and we'll provide some information in the notes.
Councillors? Okay. Moving on to item 7.3, financial statements as at 31st of July 2019. Any questions? Okay. Item 7.4, draft Safer Vincent Plan 2019 to 22. Councillor Hallett.
Just wondering if we could get some commentary around the suburb by suburb crime stats that are displayed in graphs, and I guess the perception of the utility of those for the community without more context around them.
Yes, through Mayor Cole, there will be further work done on explaining those statistics, and it's mentioned in the commentary of the report. There'll be some further work done around that, and it will be moved to the back end of the document. So I'll provide some more information between now and next week on what that will involve, and I'm also proposing to update the resolution, or the recommendation, to clarify exactly what those changes are. I just wanted to also point out that there's a couple of dates in the plan itself that will need to be updated. That are June 2019, for instance, is referenced in there, as are each of the service units. So we'll review that and explain that in the briefing notes as well.
Thank you. Just in the comments, it talks about an implementation plan will be developed following this plan. It was in response to one of the comments from submitters. I'm going to try and go back to it so I've got the exact wording. And I'm just wondering about the process from here in relation to this document. It's fairly detailed in terms of actually saying what the milestones are for each of the deliverables. I guess should this be adopted, what's the next step here in terms of implementation, and how will that be? Is an implementation plan going to be developed, and would that be something that comes to council or back through one of the advisory groups at all?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, it is the next step for us to develop that implementation plan. It's not proposed that come back to council. It'll simply be the plan by which we detail how we're going to actually deliver this document. There would be value, I think, in bringing it to the working group, though we haven't had that discussion yet. So I'll speak to the team this week and set that out in the briefing notes as well. If not, update the report if it's warranted.
Thank you.
Councillors, Councillor Hallett.
Thanks. And just curious about some commentary still about the wording of plan for the expansion and management of CCTV, and why the word expansion is included, rather than that just being a possible outcome of reviewing the CCTV strategy, which is the first deliverable.
Yes, through Mayor Cole, that's a good question. The current CCTV strategy that the city has does expand our network quite significantly from what it currently is. We haven't implemented that plan fully, so that was the reason why the word expansion was used, because we already have an existing strategy which expands our network. So that was the basis for that wording.
Councillors, just following up on the question from Councillor, I can't remember who it was now, sorry. Just in relation to the crime stats, I understand they're being moved to the back of the document. I still think they're quite heavy. There's a lot of it, and the purpose is not to sort of... I think we're kind of trying to look more at a snapshot rather than have a very detailed focus on crime statistics. So I thought that potentially that could be reduced in content.
Yes, through Mayor Cole, we agree. The commentary in the report tries to reflect that, though it's not reflected in the plan as of yet. So there needs to be some further detail as to what's going to change, including the report explaining what's going to change. And I think that needs to reflect in the recommendation as well.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay. Item 7.5, pop-up play consultation results. We don't have that report yet, so just in relation to when that will be released.
Yes, through Mayor Cole, consultation closed yesterday. There was, I was just trying to find exactly when we got it, Friday or over the weekend. There was a larger submission made with a number of queries that needed to be resolved, so we've been working through those. We got the final results through yesterday. So timing-wise, I'm actually probably have all the information as of 5 o'clock today, so there's no reason the report couldn't be circulated by the end of the week.
By the end of the week?
Yes.
You think it's Tuesday, but you're saying you have all the information.
Yeah, I don't want to overpromise and under-deliver.
Okay. It's just, yeah.
If I can get it out earlier, I will.
The more time you have, the less time we have, because we're on a
Agreed.
deadline, which is Tuesday, 6 o'clock next week. Okay. No, we can't really ask questions on that one. Information bulletin number 8.1, item 8.1. Councillor Hallett. Sorry, I was looking at you. That was a trick. Go, Councillor Hallett. I'll come back to you.
Just wondering, in the UMAG minutes of 11th of March, it appears to be just missing some apologies. Perhaps for noting. And also just a query about the register of petitions, and I guess what's the criteria for removing them from the register? Just thinking about the North Perth parking precinct traffic one, whether we consider that has been closed and addressed, because it's currently not in there.
Through my call, I think I'll need to take that on notice. I'm not sure the status of that actual petition. Obviously, there's been 3 council reports on the matter following the initial petition, so I'll just check with governance about the status of that report tomorrow, and we'll put something out with the notes.
Councillor Loden?
Just on the development application stats for 2017-18, it showed that we assessed 112.5 development approvals. I was just wondering how that happened.
Through you, Merkel, I might take that one on notice and clarify which one you're looking at. Perhaps a different one than I am, but I'll take that on notice and provide commentary in the briefing notes.
Any further questions on the information bulletin? Okay, item 8.2, adoption of council election period policy. Any questions? Okay, 8.3, a very late report received this afternoon. Not sure if you've had wished to ask questions, but very welcome to annual corporate business plan review and update. Okay. 8.4, 2019 organisational review. I will ask a question. I have raised this with the CEO, but just for the public record, I just wanted to raise it. I think clause 1 ties this item to 8.3, and it should be a standalone item, and that further information has been sought in relation to information around the outcomes of the consultation with staff and the way in which the items that are listed, the areas of work. Okay, I'll start again. So outcomes of the consultation with staff, just in terms of how that moved forward from the interim structure report that we had last time, where consultation was mooted, and what that raised in relation to how we needed to deal with work units and the way in which they are sort of spread across the different directorates. There was particular units highlighted in the report, which you're circling with your pen right now on the second page of the report, and I think Council's just seeking further information about how customer service, place management, strategy, policy and projects, innovation, parking and transportation and property management are dealt with within the 3 directorate structure. So just a little bit more information about that to be satisfied of there being an appropriate structure in place. So that request was made, but just putting that on the record.
Yes, through you, Merkel. We can amend the report to delete the first clause of in the recommendations, and we'll add additional information on staff comments and issues raised in those 5 key areas, which were the key points which were addressed as part of the organisational review process.
And just the other query was around the budget and the whether it's in name or in another name, just in relation to the Chief Financial Officer type role. Councillor Konchevsky.
Just in relation to the commentary in the financial and budget implications section of the report, Council already endorsed the move from a 4 to 3 directorate structure, so I guess that saving has already been made. I guess what would be useful is some commentary as to whether the adoption of this, new 3 directorate structure is going to have any financial or budget implications. I guess confirmation, for example, around, staff retention, and that there's no Well, anyway, you can make the commentary and that I will read it. That would be great. Thank you.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, we can add additional information on that. The anticipation would be that through a more efficient allocation of, or removing some duplication and more efficient allocation of roles and responsibilities, that we could reduce forward pressure on FTE and staffing requirements if we're as well organised as we possibly can be. Thank you.
Councillors, any further questions on 8.4? Okay. Moving to motions of which previous notice has been given. We have 9.1, notice of motion, Councillor Dan Loden, asbestos awareness. Any questions in relation to this motion? Councillor Hallett.
Just one related to, I guess, the broader concept that the public health plan is what this will be embedded into, and just wondering if we can get an update of the progress of that, or a timeline that's indicative of how that's going to progress over the next year or so, and also whether that will be coming to a council workshop for discussion.
Through you, Mayor Cole, the public health plan will definitely be coming to council workshop before being presented to council for adoption. I'll take on notice the status update of the project and provide some information in the briefing notes.
Councillors? Okay. So we have just one further item this evening, which is a confidential item. So we will say good night to those who've joined us on the live stream, and we will move behind closed doors to ask questions on this.